Welcome to In These Times, a multi-platform podcast and YouTube broadcasting channel for mental health issues. We want to address mental pain and emotional suffering by bringing you information that can alleviate your distress. And you may make some important mental shifts that bring back your light, your love, your hope. Please use the Contact Us button on our website to let us know your deepest troubles and concerns with your mental health. Help us to help you. Anxiety and fear have shot up dramatically since COVID and the lockdowns began. There's been anxiety over the virus itself, fear of the loss of someone dear, not being able to sustain a business or go to work or pay the bills. In short, we feel we are out of control. But fear has many causes, and there are many types of fear. We can try and conquer these through activities or thinking our way out of it, but when the fear is too overwhelming, we need insight into the states of anxiety. And to explain this, I'm joined by the psychotherapist and co-founder of In These Times, Previn Karyan. So Previn, anxiety, put simply, it's fear, isn't it?
That's the most important thing to understand, Chrissy, about anxiety, that there is an emotion, and it's an emotion of fear. Now, there's a huge amount of confusion in the general public about what is anxiety, because when they talk about anxiety, they often talk about panic, they'll talk about thoughts, they'll talk about intrusive thoughts. They'll say, I can't stop thinking about something and it scares me. And what they often don't connect is that there is an emotion there. And that emotion is very dominant. So it's the emotion that is pushing up the thoughts. And what we think we can do is battling the thoughts or not thinking about them or just telling them to shut up and go away or moving on. We think we can conquer the feeling. But because we don't understand feelings, and it's getting less and less that we understand feelings in psychiatry and psychology, there's this frankly quite juvenile idea that we can conquer all things in mental health through thinking, which doesn't work. We have to get back to the basics of emotions. And yes, anxiety is about the emotion of fear. And immediately I know that people suffering from anxiety will find it very hard to recognize feeling because that feeling is not spoken about. We don't talk about fear. We don't talk about the things that make us afraid.
Well, if you get in a panic about something, you don't think, well, what's going on here? What's happening? You just think, I'm in a panic.
Exactly that. You think you're in a panic. You don't feel fear. So one of the things in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis is to understand the construct of that fear, that it is generated and it comes from somewhere. And it isn't coming just from thoughts, that the thoughts keep repeating because they're driven by a feeling. And that feeling has a base, it has a structure in the mind. And that structure is what we try to get through in therapy through breaking into the feeling of fear.
And there seems to be lots of sorts of, so there's external and there's internal. So if we could have a look, if we talk about external anxiety, that would be COVID?
Yeah, so external causes such as COVID clearly is outside you. So the cause of fear, the cause of the anxiety is that you could get COVID, somebody else could get COVID, you could die from COVID, and you may have to isolate. And there is this constant fear of something around you that you cannot control. Now, other external factors can be things like you're about to lose your job. So you're constantly worrying that you're going to lose your job. That's an external fear. So there are many external fears. You may be externally afraid of somebody who's going to beat you up. And that could be through bullying, or you could be in a domestically abusive relationship or a toxic relationship. So external causes are very important to identify because if, and I stress, if that is where the fear is coming from, you know that the solution is going to be external. You're not going mad. There's nothing wrong with you. You don't need medication and drugs. There is something externally that you need to understand.
But it's still very real.
Oh, definitely real. But people in states of fear and panic and anxiety are often made to feel that they're being unreal. They're made to feel like they're being silly or irrational or just do something. Oh, get over it and stop being so silly and don't be so juvenile. That's not what's going on. They're perceiving externally a serious threat to something in themselves. Now, if it's the case of COVID, there are multiple range of fears that you could have about it. And what you have to do is work out what is it that scares me. And once you understand that, you can then make a decision about what you want to do. Do you want to get a vaccine or don't you? Do you want to wear a mask or don't you? Understand the consequences of either action, and then you are able to act. And once you act, you'll be less afraid. But to just sit there being afraid of COVID, which is, of course, the mass hysteria around it, actually gets you nowhere, because you don't understand that the fear has an external cause. It's external to you. So the solution is going to be, what decision do you want to make about that external thing?
So if it's something happening to you from another person, such as abuse from a partner or a bullying employer, you could either stay or go, but that's a bit simplistic, isn't it? Because you don't. You stay, probably.
Yeah, there are different dynamics that make you stay in states of anxiety, external anxiety. So in the case of the employer, it could be survival and economics. In the case of a domestic abuse partner, it could be fear that if they ever find you, you're in for a severe beating and you're in for a huge amount of physical assault. So you're literally afraid of the battering you're going to get. Now, in each situation, because it's external, you have different solutions. Once you understand the external nature of your fear, that you're not going mad, you're not going crazy, in the case of domestic violence or abuse, you try and find the intervention, the police, a domestic abuse charity, a refuge, if it is as bad as that. In the case of the employer, you have to find the courage eventually to say, I don't want to live with this anxiety. This job is making me anxious. I can't do this anymore. And then think about the alternatives. Now, the interesting thing, Chrissy, about COVID is that there's been mass reporting that people are not going back to work. They are fed up of bullying, horrible work conditions that frankly pay them nothing, make them work long hours and get them nowhere in life. So people are now choosing not to be anxious in work, something they would never have done before the epidemic, because they thought, oh, I've got to stay here. No, you don't.
Is your brain, does it alter because of all this trauma or anxiety?
Trauma and anxiety freezes your brain. They do talk about fight or flight responses. You have two choices. But the people who fight are usually quite resilient and healthy people, and they can fight their fears and get over it. Well, I'm afraid I don't even know what the statistic is for people who can fight fears, external fears. So the other problem is that you freeze, and that's more natural to the human condition, that fear paralyzes you. You can't speak, you can't feel, you can't act, you can't think about your freedom, you can't think about choices. And that's why the anxiety becomes more entrenched and becomes a mental health issue, because you've frozen into that condition. You can't identify, is this anxiety external, is it internal, am I going mad or not? And so your brain just freezes up.
So tell us about the internal cause of anxiety. What would that look like?
There are two different types of internal anxiety generators. One is this crushing critical voice that is constantly making you feel that you're not good, that you're not good enough, that you should be doing this, you should be doing that, you should be better. Nothing is ever good enough for you. And you don't quite know why you're thinking all of this, and you're never happy. So when people around you are praising you for all the amazing things you've done, your reaction is, this is not good enough. Now, the pressure of that internal voice comes from very critical parenting. And that is internal anxiety, where through over a commitment to duty, over commitment to meet your parents' expectations, over commitment, over exposure to what you really can't do physically, but you are driven. You are driven like a whipped animal into doing it. Technically, it's called a persecutory anxiety, that you persecute yourself, but we call it conscience. telling you you're wrong, you should do this, you should, you must,
And
you have to.
what's the effect of that? Does that make you ill?
Absolutely. It crushes you over time because you physically don't look after your body. That's one of the consequences of that type of internal anxiety. And you just run into exhaustion and fatigue and breakdown.
So that's one internal cause. And you might also have anxiety about, well, it might come out as rage or some other sort of feeling like that.
Yeah, so this is a different kind of anxiety generator. And you are very aware that you have very strong emotions, perhaps of anger, perhaps of hatred, and perhaps a need to persecute other people. And you're aware that you're quite a hateful person inside, but you're not allowed to show it. You've got nowhere to go to say, I really hate this or that, or I'm afraid of what's going on inside me. I'm afraid of my rage. In some cases, it could be, I'm afraid of my strength, that one day I might kill somebody, that I might injure someone. I've had clients, Chrissy, who are afraid that they might be paedophiles, okay? And they're perfectly normal people, but they're afraid of these unresolved sexual instincts inside them. Now, they weren't paedophiles, they were just afraid of sex. They were afraid of their sex or their sexuality. So instead of that, they started persecuting themselves, thinking that they were a paedophile. It was so irrational. Now, what you don't do is try and change the thinking. What you try and do is get into that fear.
So, yes, anxiety is always irrational.
Comes across as irrational, but it has a very good reason why it's there. So, for example, somebody constantly afraid that they're a paedophile could actually simply just be that they feel bad about being sexual. It could be that they are that they have an alternative sexuality to heterosexuality. They're afraid of that, and so they crazily end up thinking that they're paedophiles. Or it just could be that they've lived in a very repressed, frigid home. And so they're afraid of sex and sexuality, and they think there's something wrong with them. And so they're constantly afraid of having sexual feelings. So it's not always fear of anger, fear of hatred. It can also be fear of sexuality. And something else I'd like to add to that, Chrissy, in the mix is people can be afraid of themselves. They can be afraid of their own power, their own goodness, their own light. Nelson Mandela, in a speech, I think it was written for him, but famously said, the thing we fear the most is the light within us. And people can be afraid of being a strong, good, powerful person because they think they're supposed to be weak, insignificant, and insecure, and they're supposed to be a crushed little insect because that's how they've been treated either by their family or schooling or other issues. So suddenly, though, they realise that they have a lot of power inside them and they become afraid of it.
Now, the thing is what to do about all this. Now, I'm sure many places in the world where you are watching this, you're aware of cognitive behavioural therapy. In Britain, it's certainly the therapy of choice. In fact, it's the only therapy you'll get offered on the National Health Service. Would CBT do anything for your anxiety?
It will do something in the same way that CBT operates across all of the diagnostic disorders or emotional overwhelm. And what it does is it helps you to contain this overwhelm of feeling, to think differently. But it's not going to stop the generation of those feelings constantly running in the background, waiting to erupt. So cognitive behavioural therapy works on the assumption that cognition can change behaviour, that cognition can change feelings, and it can't.
It can't. So to change those feelings of anxiety, whether they're external or internal, you have to go and talk to someone like yourself.
Like a therapist, and this is the role of therapy, which is therapy is a different model that works with feelings and the mind. It's not really interested in trying to change your thinking. It's not interested in trying to judge you and get you to be better. It tries to get to, can you please say to yourself, what are you actually feeling? And usually people can't. They don't know what they're feeling anymore. This is the kind of world we're living in. And particularly in anxiety, it's doubly difficult because the feelings are frozen because of the fear. So when you ask somebody with anxiety, what are you feeling? It's almost an impossible condition. They can't give you an answer. So you need a lot of work to keep psychological contact, create a safe environment for them to eventually be able to say what they truly feel.
And they may have come from homes where it was instilled into them really that even if you were anxious, you didn't say so because feelings weren't aired.
And that's a fear of an anxiety of feelings. Having feelings is a bad thing. So you become afraid of them. So when you start to have them, you try to repress them, you try to push them down, and then you're suddenly wondering why you're having obsessional thoughts. Well, these feelings have to go somewhere, and unfortunately, they stay inside your mind and they will push back. They will become obsessional until you finally acknowledge that they're there.
So what's the worst that can happen to you if you let them run?
In anxiety states, you can result in a total collapse, in a psychosis. You can hallucinate. There's a sort of disintegration of self. In our interview on anxiety as a general introduction, I mentioned the work of Winnicott, who talked about the shattered self. And anxious people don't have a sense of self. So the core identity is shattered into pieces. Now, the important thing, what Winnicott said next was that it's like the shattering of a mirror. So what happens in anxiety is that your self becomes shattered into pieces of mirror on the floor, and those pieces are the eyes of other people. People are always looking at you. People are always persecuting you. You're never right. That's the structural condition of anxiety. You're never right.
And of course, most people will try and head to their doctors, whatever country they're living in, their general practitioner, who really can't have a lot of answers to all this.
Yeah, doctors are not trained in mental health. They're just about trained to know which drugs to dish out. They're not massively trained in that either. For that, you have psychiatric training, which is very specific to drugs and the severity of mental health conditions. So doctors provide general advice, and they will respond generally by giving you drugs. So you can't go to a doctor unless they're particularly into psychotherapy. There's a group I'll mention in a minute. But you can't go to doctors expecting a therapeutic understanding of your feelings or your mind. For that, you have to go elsewhere. Now, there is one exception based on the work of a guy called Michael Barlint, B-A-L-I-N-T. And Barlint tried to work with doctors to adopt a caring psychoanalytic relationship with patients. Of course, in today's world, that's impossible. You can't even see a doctor, let alone develop a psychoanalytic relationship with them. But Barlint was saying there's a real importance about the continuity of care for patients. And if you have doctors with that kind of training in the Barlint Society, then you're lucky because you'll have found a doctor that understands you psychologically. Otherwise, you have to go somewhere else.
And the doctor will just dish out some pills which suppress this anxiety.
That's what the whole pharmaceutical industry is based on, suppressing the neurowiring system, yeah.
So let's just try and give a word of help to these people who have been, I was going to say flattened, but almost by anxiety of COVID, of the results of it, or possibly they've seen someone who's died, the loss of a job, the loss of money, and on top of that, they're not sure how to pay the gas bill, and on it goes. What hope can you offer them?
Yeah, when the body is cut, okay, let's say you suffer a cut in your body, the body has a way of healing itself. It doesn't go and see a therapist, okay, it just heals the cut. Now, that's a model for the organic impulse in the human body, which works, whether we like it or not, to heal itself. And that's the kind of analogy that you can offer to people with anxiety, is that try if you can, and it almost seems futile as I say it, but try if you can to trust your own healing capacity. You will find the solutions to your anxiety. You will find a solution to an external fear. You will find that solution. You will find a solution to your internal rages or sexual compulsions. You will find an answer. Stay calm and try and be true to yourself. Now, staying calm is possibly an aggravating thing to say to somebody who's anxious.
Indeed.
Because they're not calm, are they? But that is something you can only hope for in the meantime. But for goodness sake, get to therapeutic help. You need a different kind of model. You need a different kind of intervention, and it's got to be technically trained. It has to have a technical frame. And it doesn't matter which school you go to, but there does need to be a technical expertise in helping you to cut through to the generation of fear inside you.
Right, so however far back this anxiety started, this fear, it can be alleviated, and the outcome would be a peace of mind?
Absolutely. I mean, I've worked with anxiety clients who have, in the middle of, say, 4 or 5 sessions in, have a flashback to a moment in their childhood where the fear began. It can be as specific as that. And that's about a trauma, which, by the way, is a second form of external fear. That traumas can happen to you, like a war or a car crash or seeing somebody get hit by a car. And they can be very traumatic external things that then make you afraid of those things happening again. Now, clients remember things in their childhood where the fear began. That first day suddenly comes to them because they're in the safe therapeutic environment. And they recall the day that they started to live in terror and fear because something went wrong. Now, of course, it was linked in with the expectations of the parents and so on. But that memory freed them from the entire pressure. So then it was a case of just having to work through supporting the client to get back into activities. But the activities were not the important thing. The memory was.
Can people become almost addicted to fear so that they keep on unconsciously looking for it?
They don't become addicted to fear. So fear is an obsessional repetition. It repeats itself until it's confronted. And often people say, look, stop thinking, do something. But people can't do something. If you can, that's great. People say, think your way out of the problem. If you can, that's great. What do you do if you can't? What if you can't do anything? What if you can't think your way out? And at that point, you need emotional intervention. So it's not a case of addiction. It's not like they're wanting to stay in a state of fear. Okay, it is that fear has come upon them, as it were, and then they can't get out.
And it's all they know.
Yeah, absolutely. It descends, or that's how they feel it, and they can't link it to any origin. They can't link it to any causality. And that's why it then goes on and on and on and on.
And it becomes part of life. So they're constantly in a state of anxiety.
Can become like that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. And what you then have to do, again, is find somebody who can provide you with that intervention that you need to get through to the mind and to the feeling.
Does it affect your family if you're living with a partner or children, if you're constantly in a state of anxiety?
If they know that you're in a state of anxiety, and usually partners or children do, it then does affect them because they are aware that you can be easily triggered into anxiety. So they're constantly trying to please you, but it will never succeed because they're not necessarily the causality of why you are an anxious or afraid person. That is somewhere else. It began a long time before you had children or you were with the partner. What happens is you haven't dealt with it, you haven't confronted it psychologically, you haven't dealt with it, you haven't confronted it psychologically, you haven't got the psychological perspective on it, and that's why you can blame it on them, you can blame it on anybody really, your jobs, society, or whatever. There's something going on in you that you need to see.
So you need to understand it, and then you can start finding someone who will help you deal with the roots.
Yes, and as you said in the introduction, Chrissy, you need insight into anxiety. You need to see it, and you need to see its structure rather than just be driven by anxiety. And bear in mind that external-internal distinction. Where is it coming from? Is it inside you, or is it caused by something that happened outside?
Well, there's an awful lot of it about at the moment, so we hope very much that this has been a great help. And Previn, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chrissy.
In These Times is entirely based on your participation and your involvement. Please use the Contact Us button on the website to let us know your thoughts. Please also make a donation so we can go on bringing you more broadcasts. Help us to help you.